and the challenges and opportunities facing museums in our time. It goes without saying that climate change we are now seeing affects not only individual disciplines or individual institutions, rather it is a genuine threat to the future of life on Earth. For this reason, we must all make it our business and join the fight against the imminent climate crisis, each in our own way and to the best of our ability. The University of Iceland has in recent years placed increased emphasis in research and education on the challenges of our time, and we have looked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals to guide us in this context. Just recently, over the last semester, we can say, we organized an ambitious interdisciplinary lecture series entitled The University and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which drew large audiences. The University of Iceland is also currently drafting a new strategy for the next few years, and climate issues and the resulting social challenges will doubtless be key issues. Museums are also truly vital in this context. Climate change affects their work in many ways, bringing both challenges and opportunities. There is no doubt that museums have a significant role to play by responsibly meeting our society's demands for increased sustainability and by actively engaging in informed discourse on climate change and its consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not keep you any longer since we have an exciting agenda ahead of us today. But before I finish, I would like to thank the National Museum of Iceland for a wonderful partnership, and I congratulate them on the honor of having been awarded the 2020 Icelandic Museum Prize for the new storage and research center I mentioned earlier at Tjarnavellir in Hafnarfjörður. This center marks the turn age in Icelandic museum work, providing a place where the treasures of the National Museum are in safe hands and offering first-rate facilities for teaching, research, and storage of primary sources, thereby safeguarding education for the experts of the future. Dear guests, we have a wonderful conference ahead of us, and I declare the Interdisciplinary Meeting, Museums and Climate Change open. Congratulations, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope you are all able to hear. Is it soundproof? Yes, good. Dear organizers, dear colleagues, dear friends, on behalf of myself and Losben Gustafsson Reinius, we would like to start by thanking very warmly the director of the National Museum, Margrét Helgrímsdóttir, and the rector of the University of Iceland, Jón Atli Benediktsson, for your very kind invitation to us to talk today on something which you probably know is by now a very dear subject to us, namely our exhibition, temporary exhibition, the Arctic while the ice is melting. And we would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate the National Museum and the University in Iceland for this great initiative. We are both looking hugely forward to listen to all speakers today and to get to know the Arctic has entered museums of all kinds and in very different ways. a hugely interesting, of course, subject. So congratulations to that. Now we will lecture, but I have the pleasure to start out by give a kind of background to the initiative to the exhibition and the idea behind it. Oh,
do you want me to start?
Yes, I think you can start it. And we would like to first show you how it looks when you enter on our homepage.
Mm? Oh, would you like to start?
Yeah,
with that?
I think we start with that, then it's done well. Mm.
Yes.
So we have a link. I'm not sure you hear us now.
Okay. Please let us know if you can't see the homepage, where you get a vision of the exhibition.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, somebody doesn't see it. Yeah. Sorry. Let's see what we could do about that.
Okay.
Do you have a problem? You do have a problem seeing it, I'm afraid. Okay, so we'll try it once more, and just let us know if it doesn't work. We press that little button and we go to this.
So I hope everyone you saw our introduction taken from the homepage. Hopefully you recognize the image from our poster, and in fact this image of road number 1 in Iceland is also hanging on the museum building, a huge image, I promise you. And a wonderful image. It gave the exact right feeling that we wanted to give for the exhibition, the feeling of a grand narrative. So, I'm still very grateful for Margaret for helping me out on this issue, and thanks again. So, let me, before I give you a little bit of a background to the idea and initiative to start this exhibition, and for the Nordiska to do an Arctic exhibition, let me just give you some hard facts about the exhibition. I think it is safe today to say that it is probably probably the largest in-house production which the Nordiska Museum has ever produced in recent times, and in many ways the most complex. And let me also immediately state that it would not have been possible to carry out without the support, the advice, and the good spirit that we have received from our Nordic colleagues. And again, let me highlight Margaret Hallgrimsdottir from the National Museum for your many advices and help throughout the events, but also Daniel Thorleifsson from Greenland and many others. It was extremely helpful. And as we heard from Margaret in the beginning, it was also a new way for us to work and collaborate right from the beginning, before we even knew how to do it. We started from the beginning to seek advice. Now, the producer of the exhibition is our producer, Matti Shevchenko, and the overall responsible producer is Elna and Noah, both people working for us here. And Elna, Noah, and I, we had earlier worked together in another and different museum organization. In fact, Lotten and I also. I will come back to that later. And Elna had produced what we can absolutely call blockbuster exhibitions from China. So the people behind the production of the exhibition were very experienced people, very visitor-oriented, but also very, very focused to take up the challenge to visualize complicated issues for very wide audiences. And in this case, the issue was highly complicated, namely the effect of climate change in the Arctic on the people living there. A rather sullen and dark subject, something that can be very hard to get visitors to come to look at and even pay for, which is essential for us as a foundation. We are semi-commercial, so it was essential that people would come and pay for the exhibition. Now, the person in charge of developing and coordinating the interdisciplinary approaches to the exhibition, together with museum staff and people from other museums and universities, was Lotten Gustafsson Reinius next to me. And I will return to Lotten's on. So this key exhibition, with its key persons and its experience and our experienced museum staff, created a relatively short period of time, 11 rooms and installations filled with technical solutions and rather outspoken artistic scenographies. The exhibition took up for the whole of our central hall in this museum, which, believe me, is a huge room. The exhibition itself took up half of the room of the hall, but projections in the ceiling of the hall fills the other half of the hall, so to speak, and creates a holistic Arctic feeling in this entire gigantic hall. And I think about 300 objects are on exhibition, mostly from our own collections, but key loans from Iceland. Again, thank you, Margaret. From Greenland, Denmark, Russia, and other loans. And we have about 400 or 500 photos and 15 films, documentary films. And Lotten will return to this later. So with this exhibition, I think the Nordisk Museum probably for the first time actually filled the entire huge hall with an exhibition, which can be experienced not only from the floor level, but also from the other floors, all the way up to the ceiling of the hall. It was opened in October 2019 by our Crown Princess Victoria, and 2 months later, that is by the end of 2019, the exhibition had transformed the Nordisk Museum from a Swedish museum to the most talked about museum in Sweden and into a Nordic museum. Press reviews were thrilled. They were numerous. We had front page coverage in all major newspapers, television, radio, interviews, and all brimmed with recommendations. Commercial bureaus, in fact, competed with one another to offer their services to us, sometimes for free, just to be, because they were eager to take part in this show. Our social media reached dream ratings in engagement and activity levels. So as a result, monthly visitor numbers 4 or 5 doubled in relation to previous years, and so did the income from ticket sale. All of a sudden, the Nordisk Museum rose to become the 4th most visited museum in Sweden, only surpassed by our namely the Vasa Museum with 1.5 million annual visitors, and the Skansen Open Air Museum with similar numbers, and the Naturhistoriska Riksmuseet with help of the Cosmonova. So, of course, you can understand we were extremely proud and happy, and we literally flew, I think, on a little pink cloud into the year 2021. A cloud of sense of success and bringing with us a huge surplus from the entrance fees. So in a wonderful success story. But my point today is not really to, I think we can wait maybe a little bit. My point today is not really to linger on the success, although you can understand that of course we are extremely happy that the exhibition went so well. But my point is actually a little different, a different one. As many fairy tales, our happy ending of our Arctic fairy tale production actually did have a rather solemn start. And the reason for this, I would like to sort of go back to the year 2015, when I took up my post at the Nordiska Museum. At that time, it is now almost 6 years ago, I was facing two major challenges. One was, which was made clear to me, one was that the visitor, the competition from our neighbors in Dyrgården, the area where we are located, the Royal Tiergarten, where we are located in Stockholm, that the competition from museums in that environment were really getting very, very hard. As already mentioned, the museums in Tiergarten had doubled or 3 or 4 doubled the visitor numbers in recent years, and the Vasa Museum, as already mentioned, right next to us, which is exhibiting a ship, reached 1.5 million visitors a year. So there was a certain pressure on the Nordiska to follow up on this. Maybe not least due to its amazing location right at the entrance to the Tiergarten, but also, of course, the huge building with its huge rooms. Now, the second challenge was a different one. Also 5 or 6 years ago, a sort of a criticism had started to become visible in various media. Academics started to criticize the Nordiska Museum for not being Nordic, but being entirely Swedish. And even dissertations started to appear devoted solely to this issue. Critics in newspapers also sometimes commented upon this in critic ways, and authors sometimes referred to the museum as suffering from some kind of schizophrenic situation, because the name was Nordic, but as soon as you entered, it really was just about Sweden. Even in other circles where you would normally expect to be backed up, critic voices were sometimes heard, namely among Swedish diplomats abroad, which sometimes referred to this Nordic museum in Sweden, which was not at all Nordic, but just Swedish. And maybe with the new Nordic Museum in Seattle in mind. So there was a new situation, how to deal with the sort of the name that did not really match the content. And so these were probably the two major challenges that I would like to mention here. And therefore, I, of course, started to wonder what to do. How can we sort of eliminate this opposition? And at this point, it was helpful to me to actually look back at the founder of the foundation Nordiska Museet, namely Arturo Hazilius. As you may know, the museum, it was founded in 1873 already, long time before the building was ready. And in that period, we still had what you sometimes call the Scandinavian or Scandinavianism, a sort of Scandinavian spirit. And there's no doubt that Hazilius was, of course, not only part of that and influenced by this spirit, but he certainly promoted it. You should also remember that Sweden was still in a union with Norway. And in 1873, it was really just a little bit more than half a century ago that Sweden had lost Finland. So the memory of this grand Scandinavian country was still warm. The spirit of Arturo Hazilius was very much a bit nostalgic to look back at rural life as it used to be in Sweden, and nostalgic because his viewpoint and his looking back took place at a crucial time for most countries in the Western world, namely the industrialization. And rural life and lifestyles were simply disappearing. And the Scandinavian world was appearing. Arturo Hazilius documented this in his own way by collecting artifacts, but he actually also started out by gathering objects from other Scandinavian countries, what is today other Scandinavian countries like Norway, but also Estonia and Denmark, and from Iceland and from Greenland. So it tells you a little bit about the worldview when the museum was founded. Later on, in 1907, when the building was finally ready and inaugurated, Arturo Hazilius was no longer alive. And the whole situation and the whole society had changed quite a lot from during those 3 decades since the foundation. It even changed to an extent that the building, which when it was finally ready, was conceived as quite old-fashioned. It's Scandinavian castle-inspired architecture. So society around surrounding the Nordic Museum had changed. Nordic ambitions dwindled, and there was a more focus on the national state of Sweden. And also you should remember that other museums were founded and gradually appeared. In the 30s, the Historiska Museum, really at the Archaeological Museum of Sweden, appeared. And this took away the initiative which Arturo Hazilius had very much hoped for, that the Nordics should really tell the whole story of Sweden from the very beginning of science of life in Sweden to modern times. And instead, the Nordiska Museum came to tell the story from 1500 onwards. And in the 30s, the collections from Greenland were deposited in the Ethnographic Museum. And even, I think, some of our Samian collections. So it tells you a little bit about the transformation of the society relatively shortly after the building was ready. if we jump forward in time to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the focus on Sweden became more and more evident. And collections from other Nordic countries were gradually repatriated to Norway, Iceland, Estonia, and so on. And the Nordiska Museum became more focused also, or rather I should say, one of the focus areas became the 1950s, which in Sweden has come to be seen as a little bit of a golden age period. Something which I personally am a bit puzzled about, because the 1950s is not really the golden age in Denmark, where I'm originally from. But this is a different story. And the museum became became known for as a Nordic museum for Swedish trends and traditions. So as you see, with this background in mind, when I took up my post in 2015, the challenge really was how to bring back, to eliminate the dichotomy between the title of the museum and the content, but also to how to bring back a new, so to speak, Nordic vision for the museum in a more modern way. And here I would like to highlight, as it sometimes is, for a director, you plan and plan and plan, but sometimes it's actually accidental meetings or incidents that come to your help. And this was how it became for me. And I would like to highlight two really accidental meetings or incidents that suddenly came to my assistance. The first incident was that I invited one of our trustees for the Nordiska Museum, Sverker Salin, a well-known professor and very much engaged in the Arctic and in climate changes, to a coffee and a very good croissant, I remember. And we had a general talk about the challenges of the Nordic Museum. And it was during this conversation when Sverker talked so, as only Sverker can do, so enthusiastic about the Arctic world, but also, of course, the huge challenges facing this world, that the idea came up that maybe an Arctic exhibition. And I felt so convinced about this idea and initiative, and immediately set to work. But to my big surprise, this idea was not really received very well in many circles. In fact, many people questioned it and said, why should a museum in Sweden deal with the Arctic? We have nothing to do with the Arctic. And there was even a journalist, I remember, who wrote that for the Nordic Museum to do an exhibition on climate changes seemed a political correct exhibition. And people who know me will know that the last term I think you can put on me is to call me political correct. So I still remember that I was extremely puzzled by this classification. I also remember I invited the then Arctic ambassador for a lunch to the museum, the Arctic ambassador to Sweden. And he said he was completely new in his office, and he said there's absolutely no interest in Sweden for this. Nobody can see why should Sweden have an ambassador to the Arctic. No one can see the idea, and there's no one to talk to here in Sweden. He felt completely alone. But then at one point I took part in a conference in Washington at the Swedish embassy in Washington, and that was organized by the Arctic Authority here in Sweden. And that opened not only my eyes, but also confirmed me that, well, there is an issue here and it needs an exhibition. So as you understand, I went along with the idea. And then something happened. I have not yet been able to date the exact incident, but something happened in the early 2016, and which totally changed the situation. One of the incidents was that the major newspaper in Sweden, Dagens Nyheter, their editor of the cultural section, Björn Wiman, he launched, I would say, a lasting, still going on campaign about global heating in global warming and the melting icebergs in the Arctic. You couldn't open a newspaper. It was daily. You would see articles about melting icebergs. And suddenly, you couldn't turn on the radio, you couldn't turn on the television. It was all about Arctic. So the situation in Sweden, it really changed, and within a short time, from really to have been a non-subject for a non-issue in the consciousness of the average population, it became the issue. And that, of course, was a huge help. And the second incident, before I hand over to Lotte, was also totally accidental. I attended a Christmas lunch at the university, and there I met Lotte, whom I knew very well from earlier on because we have worked in the same museum organization. And suddenly I realized that there was only one person who could be the right person to handle that tricky task, to take upon her and lead the content of this exhibition. Because to lead the content of the exhibition, you needed a person who had worked internationally, but also worked in a museum, and you came from the ethnographic museum at that time, worked with museum collections, but also worked as an academic. And that solved, in a way, also another problem that had come up, which was that we needed to find a new solution for the so-called Hazilius professorship. The money for that professorship, going back to a donation in 1918, had sort of dwindled to next to nothing, and we needed to find a different solution. And the solution was to enter a new cooperation with Stockholm University, and to, with the help of Stockholm University, co-finance a guest professorship called the Hazilius guest professorship for 3 years, and to provide that guest professorship with a subject. And the subject was people in the Arctic region in the light of the climate changes. And before I hand over to you, Lotte, I would say that with these two major incidents, my problems were very much solved. And today I look at in the subway and see our marketing campaign, and I feel that the Nordisk Museum has become Arctic, and thereby also Nordic again. And Lotten, I'm happy to hand over this computer to you and tell us about that huge challenge that you had to take up.
Thank you, Sanne. And I am aware that you who are listening in Reykjavik, you only see the PowerPoints at this moment, but you can maybe hear there's a slight shift of dialect here. Yes, thank you, Sanne, for that nice handover. I did enter the situation and I accepted the challenge, and I would say that this was one of those offers that you can't turn down. And as mentioned, I do have a background. I'm an ethnologist, and I am connected to Stockholm University. And at this time, I was also the museum director of the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm. So issues dealing with world history, ethnographic collections, indigenous culture and issues, and how to narrate about globalization using different examples also from all over the world were very much key interests to me. And of course, I think it's fascinating when I listen to Sanne again. You really are correct that at this point, not on Iceland maybe, but in Sweden, this was still kind of a non-issue, and we stepped in right at the moment where consciousness was starting to grow. And this was, of course, both frightful and fantastic. In a way, you could say that while the Nordic Museum did expand its frame, something, of course, also crucial happened when it comes to the way people think about the Arctic. For long in the Scandinavian South, having been considered sort of this stable periphery, maybe mostly in nature, it was now at the center of attention globally, at the center of global concern due to climate change and the threats of global warming. And of course, a lot of conflicting interests as well. And this, in a way, decenters the South in interesting ways and shows new connections, new and old connections. And not least does it show the Arctic as a place where new grand narratives about man, maybe mankind as well, and man as a species are told today. So what could be more thrilling than to step in and accept this challenge? And it was, as mentioned, a collaboration between the university and the Nordic Museum. And my very position was sort of I had a leg in each camp, so to say. And I say the assignment was not least to keep the path in between open, a path that this professorship in many ways epitomized. It was, it goes back to donation made 100 years ago, and now it was sort of reactivated with new issues by us. So I say, of course, to the exhibition, that's a striking major outcome. But to me, also professionally, I would say that the development of method has been another interesting outcome. And I think it's very much the issues that you raised today in this symposium, because it deals a lot with how do you create new genre, new ways of working together that will allow for a more polyphonous co-creation of knowledge, co-curation of pressing issues. And what's the role of the museum in this? I mean, could we have done this solely in the seminar rooms at the campuses? I say not, because it's also a matter of bringing together the knowledge tradition of the university to bring the collections and expertise of the museum into this sort of node of different kinds of expertise. Well, one of the wonderful pictures that we found when we visited the museums in Nuuk early on in this project, and of course it's just such one of those images that evokes your sublime, highly effective sense of wow, what's this place? And it's the Greenland inland glacier, one of the remaining traces of, well, a time when most of Scandinavia was covered with ancient ice, and now it's still there on Greenland, but as we all are aware, it's disappearing today in a speed that is hard to imagine, hard to measure. It's about 100,000 million tons of ice disappearing each year. It's hard to grasp. But at this moment, when this painting was made, I mean, the ice was still impossible to consider as anything but just sort of the most stable thing outside of culture, threatening a challenge to mankind, something placed outside of culture. And to be there as a researcher, as a polar expedition member, such as this little crew of Rasmussens around 1890, it would sort of epitomize the ideals of that time's pioneering years, the ideas of masculinity and the scientist as a hero stretching beyond the potential of ordinary people. And of course, the role of science has also changed. Not only do we think of the Arctic in different ways today, but as here, where you see the yearly measurement of the Mount Kebnekaise in Swedish Sapmi, up in the mount, it's actually the highest peak, more than 2,000 kilometers above the sea level, but its very highest peak is shrinking today because it's a glacier. And this is the yearly measurement. It's a colleague at Stockholm University, professor of geography, and of course media is there to capture the moment. And her whole posture is of course something very different. Today the ice is not only fearsome and static, it's rather changing rapidly and vulnerable, and her posture is also something very different. And I think, although this of course is tragic, that it's a moment of opportunity in a way where new agents start to open up for other kinds of ways to convey their knowledge. I mean, this is not only, how does she, just by lending this symbolic yearly measurement as a symbolism of what's going on, of climate change. Gunhild Rosqvist is one of the scientists who partake in, she's sort of open to cooperation with artists, with museums, with media, and as a new ways to translate the meticulous work of the scientists, the numbers, the scales, into something new, more effective, something that will reach out. And I'm sure some of you think also of a similar sort of ceremonial rite, a mourning of a disappeared glacier, the Uppjökull on Iceland. We are of course aware of that strong expression as well. Well, this is part of another outcome of the project, because there were so many people involved, not only the colleagues from our Nordic museums, and the curators and producers and other experts at the museum. But in this process, I had the opportunity to work as a kind of sheepdog, drumming together an interesting and broadly multidisciplinary network with members of all faculties, but also reindeer herders would meet astrologists, geologists would talk to philosophers. There would be fictional writers discussing issues of resource extraction together with mineralogists and industrial historians. We had a whole series of seminars, and we talked about this as a series of seminars on geocultural change, because the idea here was also inspired by the ideas of Donna Haraway that, I mean, scientists need to meet speculative fabulation. We all need new alliances and less hierarchical meetings where many voices and ways to create knowledge can encounter each other. And this is actually what it looks like when you open a book. That is another outcome of the project. It's called Arctic Traces, Arktiska spår. And I'm happy to say that there are some really nice Icelandic contributions there as well, among the 40 participants. We wanted to give an image of the process, and so we worked visually just to show how all the different things came together. An inventory of the museum's collections that also stretched out to visits to other storages, other museums was at the core of this, but also the many different fora where we had discussions with our reference group during seminars, and sometimes scaled up to public meetings, and the audience came and sometimes offered new acquisitions and new narratives. The collections, yes. As mentioned, some of the Arctic collections held at the Nordic Museum have interesting institutional voyages, moving, for instance, from that Nordic frame into a more ethnographic one. But there are also remains, as for instance, as you see to the left, objects collected by a colonial servant on Greenland, kolonibestyrer Brummerstedt, who collected things and acquired things for Hazilius at the very beginning. Interestingly, in the storage, these were kept in a drawer next to a small collection from St. Barthélemy. So in a way, you could say that the Nordic collection also has some traces of a Nordic colonial history. We have also a photographic collections holding 1.5 million. No, sorry, the photographic, I'm reading my own picture wrong here. Photographic collection is big also, it's 1 million objects, 1 million photographs. And the biggest maybe Sami collections in Europe. One thing that's particular about it is that it holds Sami cultural history from Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Russia. In the exhibition, we thought it was one thing that was really satisfactory was to sometimes show the objects in a themed way, where things used by hunters from all over the Arctic would meet and encounter one another. It's not only an exhibition on sort of ethnic groups or particular material culture, it also tells a lot about long-standing relations, about trade, invention, and ways to get by in the Arctic, where groups have inspired each other, where groups have migrated and followed after one another. And of course, it was crucial to work with one of the critiques against ethnographic exhibitions, what Johannes Fabian has phrased the ethnographic presence, the danger that we portray other cultures and outside of the sort of industrial urban centers as sort of frozen in time. And when you see the cultural history collections, you might think that this is what it's still like. It's never changed. It's a kind of not only frozen ice, but frozen time. So what we thought was really important was, of course, to bring in testimonies, narratives, and current research on the situation today. One of the sort of major messages of the exhibition being that it's far from only nature, it's culture, and it's the home today to 4 million people experiencing grand changes in their everyday life. So all over in the exhibition, you find 10 big sort of displays that project documentary films, and most of them were made directly to serve for the exhibition. And sometimes it was people from the museum and myself who went ahead and started and did sort of fast ethnographic fieldwork, and other times we cooperated with scholars. So this is, you see some of the material brought together from as different places as Jamal, Swedish Sápmi, Svalbard, Rovaniemi, and also Iceland. I hope we'll have time to show the short film from Iceland, because I think it will be really interesting for us, not least, to hear what you think. Oh, no, that's the last one. So what we'll do is, the films are all themed, and the idea was to do at least one thing on climate tourism. And of course, the crack in this exhibition, the raptor is sort of the main symbol, but we also wanted to talk a lot on how this crack runs through all of us, because we are in many ways victims to climate change, but also perpetrators. We're part of the problem. And how do we deal with this in different ways? The people who want to stay along in northern Sweden and then work with car testing in the global car testing industry, for instance, and on Iceland, the dependency on the tourism, but also an awareness of the difficulties that go with it.
Okay, we have a little bit more time if anyone has any questions for Sanne or Lotten.
While you think, I might take the opportunity to mention another outcome of the project, which is the anthology. I did say a few words about it, but I think we also thought about that as a kind of, it's not your ordinary exhibition catalogue, really. While there is a lot of interesting writings on objects in the collections and photographs and images that you might see in the exhibition, it also brings this into a larger and very multi-voiced discussion on changes in the Arctic and the Arctic's nature and culture. It has recently written research articles, longer ones, and 30 sort of shorter essays on where you get different perspectives. And I think in a way, of course, exhibitions are perfect media to bring together different kinds of perspectives, voices, and narrative. I mean, it's much more difficult to do in a newspaper article or a research book. When you walk in space, you can actually bring in scales and temporalities that are so far from each other otherwise. And we wanted the book to reflect this. So when Margaret mentioned sort of new interpretations of objects, she adds one herself here. She writes about the famous Elvpotten you can see in Reykjavik. and when you write about it here, Margaret, this is what it looks like. You also bring up the ethics of the stewards of nature and sort of the human and more than human relations that these old hidden people conveyed. So it's sort of a moral from the traditional narratives from Iceland, and it's done beautifully through this with the story about the Elvpotten. And we also have articles by Sigurjón Hafsteinsson and Tina Gretarsdóttir on the Icelandic turf house and how to think with turf, and as another way of living on Earth, more in harmony with Gaia and other species. And you have an article by Katla Kjartansdóttir and Kristin Schramm on the invasive processes of tourists and species and on endangered species on Iceland and the role of the puffin and the polar bear symbols. So I just wanted to thank you all as well for these contributions.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks to the National Museum and the University of Iceland for arranging this interesting meeting on climate change and relations to museums. I will focus on natural history museums and climate change, their role in this issue, and I will base my talk mainly on issues and matters that the Icelandic Museum of Natural History is dealing with, even though my points, they are also are general points referring to not only other natural history museums, but museums in general. So basically, I will discuss a little climate change, if it's a fact or fiction, and it's an important point to discuss And I will touch upon criteria and references for museums as a guidance in their work. Secondly, I will touch upon what natural history museums are doing in relation to this crisis or issue. And I have there two main subdivisions, research, documentation, and conservation. And secondly, it's the information sharing or dissemination of information. I do apologize to our colleagues abroad that the slides, they are in Icelandic, but I will give my talk in English. I hope that will suffice. So it's reasonable to discuss this point if climate change is a fact or fiction. You only have to refer to the recent president election in the States, but science has for a considerable since a considerable time showed and we have verifications and facts about that this is something that is going really on. But many people, they have difficulties to face something that is changing their view of the world. And many people, they turn to an easy way out. And this caricature on the left demonstrates my point. We have the climate crisis and the changes as a scientific truth, in parentheses. But nevertheless, there are really quite many that doubt this, the least politicians, even here. So, but why has why has the climate change crisis taken so long to be taken seriously, and why have the actions been quite so slow? Just compare this to our reactions to the COVID-19, which have been swift and they have been firmly grounded by science. Maybe we need a board of wise advisors like here in Iceland, the triple wise men's board on the coronavirus. I think this is a subject that the audience should consider. Well, climate change is a fact, and the scientific community agrees upon that a primary cause is our human actions. So to solve the problem, we have to deal with it ourselves, the mankind. But climate change in Iceland is documented by scientific bodies like the Met Office, the Marine Research Institute, University of Iceland, the Agricultural University, the Icelandic Institute of Natural History, and as well the Icelandic Museum of Natural History. This is done by research and monitoring and so on. And one of the bases that the museums in general can use, not only in Iceland, but also in other countries, by their referring to their appropriate research institutions, is to use the report by the Icelandic Scientific Committee on Climate Change. So that was published in 2018. And the first author is the Halldór Björnsson, a scientist, a meteorological scientist at the Met Office. It's a really good synthesis of what is going on in Iceland due to climate change and how to also solve the problem, what means we have to do to cope with the crisis. But the evolution of climate warming or in Iceland is the same as in a global perspective. From 65 and onwards, we are documenting significant warming in elsewhere. And the consequences of climate change, they are of course manifold. Just to name some few, precipitation in Iceland is forecasted to increase. Of course, glaciers will retreat and disappear, which means that runoff discharge of the land will increase. The sea level will most likely rise by 30 to 40% of global average rise in sea level, probably at most about 1 or 1.5 meter. And this is a special issue that Icelanders have to look carefully at. I will touch upon this later. Then, of course, the oceans and as well as the air will get warmer, and here is a particular Icelandic issue. It's the acidification of the oceans, which means a lot for our industry and life here on the island, affecting the marine ecosystem, the fish stocks, and so on. And this is the special point that I think museums in Iceland could look specifically at. It's the marine ecosystem, the rise of the sea level, and change in the ecosystem because of acidification, which is a special issue here in Iceland and is related to local conditions in the marine ecosystem. The ocean around Iceland is getting more acid than elsewhere, and this can have real bad consequences. So I mentioned this thing about the rise of sea level. If we are going to prioritize our emphasis in our activity, I think we should look at the coast, at the cultural and natural heritage and monuments in that area because of the rising sea level and increasing erosion. We are losing cultural and natural heritage quite fast now. You can see the Icelandic map here. This is a picture taken from the report of the Scientific Climate Committee, Icelandic, and the rise of sea level is quite different depending on where on the island we are. The most profound effects relating to sea levels rise are the southwest coast, west fjords, and along the Northland, and so the priority should be on the coastal heritage, cultural and natural. And the second one I think is important is our issues related to we have quite serious, there's a lack of information in particular areas concerning biodiversity, and as applies in general, this is mostly among the smaller organisms as well as how ecosystems function. So we have, I will mention you 2 or 3 examples of the fact of climate change in Iceland, and one of the most profound effects we see almost between months or years, at least very, very well between years. It's the retreat of glaciers. And here I put forth an example that the Icelandic Museum of Natural History is related to, and this is a monitoring of a small glacier on Oak Mountain, and a forming of a lake, freshwater lake, at the top of the crater with the disappearing ice and glacier. So I am referring to that this is not just a sad and bad thing that is happening by the effects of climate warming. There's also some opportunities and interesting thing happening, like the formation of a new ecosystem, a new life, and there we have a chance to follow up the making of life from the start and onwards. We have also the documentation of climate warming in our lakes. The lakes, they are getting warmer. The blue line here, this is the mean lake temperature in one of our largest Lake Þingvallavatn, over a period from 62 to 2017. And we are getting unprecedented records of warming, and the warming of the lake follows the warming of the air within the catchment area. And this affects the warming of the lake, affects the ecosystem structure. There is a disappearance of important diatoms that carry up the primary production in the lake. And again, this affects the food of the Arctic char and affects the fish populations. We have another example of a monitoring project that the museum is participating in, and this is Lake Elliðavatn within the capital area, a very shallow lake, much shallower than Lake Þingvallavatn. Mean depth is 1 meter compared to 35 meters in Lake Þingvallavatn. And the black dots, these are the cuts per unit effort of Arctic char. The open circles are the cuts per unit effort of brown trout. Arctic char is a cold adapted species, whereas the brown trout is heat tolerant. And then you have the rise in lake temperature, rising significantly over this period, 87 to 2010, and then we have new additional data. So we are talking about effects because of climate change throughout the ecosystem and the food web. But what about the basis, so to speak, that the museums can apply and use in their activity and have some guidance. Firstly, it's the action plan by the Icelandic government in climate change, and there is a new release now in June 20, and there are really many issues touching upon climate change and the Paris Agreement. And in particular for museums and partners of the museums, is that funds will be raised for research and dissemination of information related to climate change. And museums should and can, of course, utilize this opportunity. I have specifically mentioned here particular chapters within the action plan of the government for the museums that I think they should look into. Also, the UN goals on sustainable development, there are particular chapters and goals related to climate issues, and also here I have mentioned the goals that relate strongest to museological work. Then there is a new cultural policy that is being adopted now, probably this year. It has been in work for last 1.5 years or so. This is the official policy on cultural heritage. and there is a specific relation to climate change, and also they also refer to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So also within the policy of the Icelandic Institute for Natural Museum, we have several clear relations to activities on climate change. And this applies to the collection and collections, documentation, and especially to our research. For the first every 5 years, we rewrite our policy in research, and now there are specific chapters on climate change and how we deal with that in our activity. Finally, as a basis for museums in general to work with, is the handbook on conservation of museological collections. The National Museum published the first volume in 2011, and then again the second in 2017. And even though the concept or the word climate change doesn't occur in these volumes, there are really many guidance and that refers actually to climate change and the effects of warming. I just took this picture of the larvae of the Ricea vespa that was first identified in Iceland in 1974 in a natural history museum and made a havoc there. But this species, they thrive very well in warm and dry conditions, and that's one of the consequences of climate warming, that we have to cope with warming and drying. So what do natural history museums do to tackle the climate issue, crisis issue? Well, firstly, of course, research and documentation and preservation or conservation. Research on our natural heritage the research is the foundation of all the information sharing and dissemination of information. Without it, there will be misinterpretation and misunderstanding and lack of information. So the research projects that the museum participates is in collaboration with others, especially the University of Iceland and the University College at Hólar. And we have several research projects going on, and I'm not going into detail of them, but just to mention that this the latest one is in the making. It's a really big project among many institutions, the University of Iceland, the University of Akureyri, the Marine Research Institute, the University College of Hólar, and Icelandic Institute of Natural History and others. And the main aim is to promote understanding of biodiversity in Iceland, which has clear relations to the climate crisis. And it involves the making of a public policy on biodiversity, research, documentation, data storage, conservation, access to the information, and dissemination. And this work was initiated actually by a European project, the EMBL, and it stands for the European Molecular Biological Laboratory, an intergovernmental laboratory for life sciences, founded in '74 with 27 members and Iceland included. And in short, the aim is to integrate all the levels of the ecosystems and to understand the processes from the smallest to the largest, and with an emphasis on the smaller parts of the ecosystems because they have been left out. And of course, to understand our life, we have to link the things together. So the participants in the biodice, they will pick research projects with EMBL in Iceland, all related more or less to the climate crisis. So the role of the Icelandic Museum of Natural History in biodice and its relations to EMBL is participation in research and mainly in the field of freshwater ecology, as well as archaeology of the marine mammals. And the latest one is the big biodiversity project that is on the behalf of the museum is directed by Professor Skúli Skúlason. And the other main role of the museum in this biodice EMBL is a central role for dissemination of information to the general public and society on biodiversity in Iceland and its relation to the globe. And not the least, this is my second last slide, the importance of the museums in solving. We can solve our information, we can term our information sharing and dissemination of information about nature and climate change as a solution to the problem. And this is our most important task, is to mitigate our knowledge and knowledge of others to the general public. And right now we do this, the museum does this at its exhibition in the Pearl. The exhibition is on the freshwater in the nature, in Icelandic nature. And we have specific programs by the teachers on climate issues. One is the weather and climate change, and the other relates to biodiversity and the effects of climate change. We also, the museum also functions as advisors to others, and here I present an example, and this is from the exhibition in the Pearl by the other partner there, the private sector and the Perla Norðursins. They are running their glacial show there, Jöklasýning, and we provided them with the information on the glacier and the life on and within the glaciers. We also they have also items on loan from us on their exhibition, and we contributed a lot to the text of their exhibition. And finally, we look really forward to our future on information sharing, not the least on climate change related issues, and that is in our new headquarters that we will probably be within 2 years. We will work with most probably the marine ecosystem, the coastal ecosystem, and issues related to climate change, sea level, disappearance of glaciers, and if it were not cloudy here, you would see the glacier Snæfellsjökull that will maybe disappear within 100 years. But let's hope it doesn't. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and my name is Bergsveinn Thorsson, and I am Yes, a recent PhD in museology, but I'm also a postdoctoral fellow at the Department for Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to present and to be part of this very interesting and so far great seminar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about an ongoing project of mine, the development of a handbook on climate action for museums, cultural and science centers, galleries, and exhibition spaces. This project was made possible with funding from the Museum Council of Iceland and the Icelandic Center for Research, and is developed in collaboration with the Research Center in Museology at the University of Iceland and museologist Þorvaldur Gröndal. So, is this handbook? This handbook is a research-based project aimed at helping museums, heritage centers, galleries, exhibition spaces, etc., to navigate the climate crisis. It is a bottom-up guide to provide pathways to build competences, knowledge, and skills to promote understanding and action on climate change. While museums are quite prevalent in the process of making this handbook, it is supposed to be useful for other institutions, companies, or organizations that are involved in the dissemination of natural and cultural heritage in Iceland. So it is a bit confusing because in Iceland we have a very distinct definition with museum laws that talks about museums, centers, and exhibitions. So I will be, using these some of these words quite interchangeably, but I hope you won't be confused. But what do I mean when I say it is a research-based? Quite simply, that the handbook is built on existing literature and research, both within museology, but as well with climate change communication. What you could refer to as environmental museology or even climate change museology is a growing field, and today we have numerous initiatives very actively working on creating knowledge, building up competences, examining museum practices, establishing diverse pathways towards climate action. So this handbook draws inspiration from that, but at the same time, I also want to emphasize the fact that it is thought to be a bottom-up approach, where the aim of the handbook is to build competences and provide pathways for smaller museums as well. But usually you have scholars, practitioners, and leading institutions setting the bar for appropriate skills or professional practice. This handbook is supposed to be a wayfinder, sketching up pathways gradually leading to better practices, emphasizing exploration, smaller institutions or museums, centers, what have you, locate their own strengths and start building from there. This is in part a response to a problem of setting the bar perhaps too high for small institutions, but also a response to the fact that the complexities of the climate crisis is challenging many traditional assumptions we make in regard to museum practice. For example, the challenge of meeting new demands of energy efficiency and sustainable development when it comes to preservation of heritage, when the best equipment is not sufficient anymore because it might not be environmentally friendly. But these challenges are not only present on a technical level, they are also ethical challenges, challenges on a philosophical, or dare I say, existential level. I think this quote from Andrés Snær Magnusson's latest book on time and does actually explain this crisis in a way quite well. We are confronted by changes that are more complex than most what our minds typically deal with. These changes surpass any of our previous experiences, surpass most of the language and metaphors we use to navigate our reality. The book was originally published in Icelandic, but I believe that it is now available in English and also Norwegian. And I highly recommend that you get a hold of this book, because it's a very good start to these types of contemplations about the effects of climate change, ethical questions, and also questions about sort of how we can actually grasp the crisis through language and experience. So the crisis is a complex phenomenon, an object of knowledge that is not easily grasped by a single mode of analysis. There is no doubt that human activity is accelerating the climatic changes of the planet. That is simply a scientific proven fact. Implications of the climate crisis are societal, economic, political, cultural, and ethical. It is a messy assemblage of not just measurable facts, but of emotions, lived experiences, not only globally, but also on a local level. Putting this in the perspective of heritage, climate change is a threat with the sea level rise, in particular, threatening to basically wash away heritage, but it also forces us to think and rethink the role of heritage. And again, reconsider traditional assumptions that are still prevalent in heritage work in the museum field and the wider spectrum of natural and cultural heritage dissemination. And there I'm talking about the relationship between nature and culture, the connections of between global and local, the individual and the collective. So drawing from museology, there exists a lot of material explaining the potentials of museums to engage with climate change and what makes them an ideal place to promote understanding and action on the topic. First is, of course, the existing knowledge and expertise that can be connected to the complex phenomenon. The importance of cultural perspective is imperative to break up the binary of nature and culture. Spaces, that is museums, where you can experience artistic expressions and historical perspectives that are of importance. And I think what Lotten mentioned earlier today about the potential of exhibitions, making them great spaces to tie together diverse perspectives, spaces of exploration where the complexity of climate change, the implications can be explored. I list that make museum centers and galleries ideal for climate action, but this is, of course, sort of an ideal list where you're kind of listing the potentials and what museums can become. But there's also the question and the fact that museums, not all museums, are equally equipped to realize these different potentials. So as part of the research project or making of the handbook, I wanted to understand the particularities of the museum field or the heritage dissemination of heritage field in Iceland. So an important part of making the handbook was sort of a research or kind of a mapping exercise, mapping the field, where I was working in close collaboration with Þorvaldur Gröndal, that was made possible through funding from the Icelandic Research Center. So over the summer of 2020, we started mapping the field. We started collecting information about different museums, centers, and exhibitions that that exist in Iceland. And we, or more Þorvaldur, he collected or made a list of 134 of these organizations. And the first step in this mapping was to actually look at how they present or how their online presence and how the available policy documents, if they mentioned climate change or dealt with it in any way. So the question was, is it visible? Is climate change visible in museums' statements or policy? further on, we sent out a list of questions to these 134 organizations, asking a bit more closely, because what we found out through the sort of mapping of online presence, the the climate change was not very visible, if we are using a very scientific term. But out of 48 museums that are, accredited and so-called head museums, we could find 10 examples of climate change-related policy statements or dissemination. And in total, out of the 134 organizations, we found about 20 examples, which makes it about 15%. So further on, to actually take a closer look, because we all know that the online presence of all these organizations are, not equally good. So we sent out a list of questions, 6 questions, contacted these organizations and had questions about policy and management, perceived importance of climate change, their experience dealing with climate change, and the challenges preventing engagement, and future plans, attitudes, and possibilities. So currently, we have so far received 32 replies, which makes up about 24% of total organizations we tried to contact. And we are still sort of, collecting replies. The point of mapping exercise was to actually help shape what the pathways the handbook would actually highlight. So I just wanted to, very quickly point out a few of the findings from these questionnaires and from the sort of mapping exercises. So kind of contrary to the lack of visibility of climate change, online or in policy documents, majority of respondents think that climate change is an important topic. There were occasional respondents who didn't really think climate change had anything to do with a specific field of their organization. And we got this question as well, sort of a question to answer our question, does a small local cultural museum have any purpose of engaging with climate change? And over half of the respondents are still thinking about and discussing climate change within their organization, even though it's not, visible in official policies or statements or any kind of dissemination. So there were examples of works in progress, ongoing work on, refining policies or projects in the making. So the challenge is that kind of became quite apparent through, these answers that we have received, that there are issues of framing. A lot of the people who responded to our questions, they talked about the difference between environmental issues and climate change, that they were in some way dealing with the environment, but not specifically with climate change. So this issue of framing poses a question, are environmental issues and climate change separate concerns? And is anything unaffected by climate change? So I think in response to that, what is important with the handbook is to kind of address climate change in a wide perspective, just like I was talking about earlier, as sort of a complex phenomenon, as something that has not only natural implications, cultural, political, ethical implications. Another thing that became quite apparent in the findings is the lack of resources. And this is something that I think most museum people are quite familiar with. And in Iceland in particular, you have small organizations, you have few staff, scarce resources, and this question about sort of where to begin. Is climate change just too big to grasp. How can we actually encourage small institutions, small organizations throughout the island to actually respond to this call? Because I believe that, you see climate change is becoming a bigger issue within the museum field, for example, but also its presence is much bigger within media in the latest years. It's becoming more and more pressing. So I think it is inescapable for museums, if they want to think of themselves as, socially relevant institutions, to address questions and concerns about climate change. So from this, I wanted to emphasize the fact that the handbook should be this kind of guide or a tool to navigate in gradual steps to actually build up competences and become better and better in engaging with climate change. So this is pretty much where the project stands now, that we have the handbook, and I have outlined these 5 interconnected pathways that will be emphasized in the handbook itself. And these pathways are, as you can see, heritage, dissemination, strategic management, and responsibility. And you can see the Icelandic words. So it's, because it is made for Icelandic museums, it is in Icelandic, but I'm trying to kind of translate this as we go. So these are 5 signposts that are pointing to a path towards realizing the potential to promote understanding and action on climate change. Similarly, I've mentioned here ideal potentials that museums have, that you can find so very well thoroughly discussed in museum literature. I just wanted to to explain a little bit these different pathways, and also emphasize that, even though they are presented as different pathways, they are interconnected. You can start with 1, you can start with 2 or 3, and they will be set up in these kind of like steps where you are sort of, starting something, like, starting a collaboration, and then strengthening collaboration, and then maintaining collaboration. At the same time, heritage is connected to what has already been discussed today, is sort of, what museums, for example, have in their collections. They are huge repositories of knowledge and material evidence of, narratives, stories about culture that are of relevance to, climate change and the effect it will have. So just, centering on collaboration, for example, it starts with just this easy kind of, questions. What do I, as in the organization, have to contribute to a collaboration? For example, museums, of course, have spaces to contribute. They have expertise. They have networks, connections to other museums or to the local population. Who should I reach out to start a collaboration? And I think this is also something that has come up today with this importance on collaborating with diverse experts, combining different disciplines in order to tackle the complexity. But I would also want to, emphasize that, it's important to connect to your local communities, because what is a big factor and a big challenge with, climate change communication is that you have to somehow find this local relevance to actually connect to people. You of course have, all these facts about, the global effects and how, climate change is sort of happening globally, but you also have to think about what kind of an effect will it have on the local community, on your own community. And so connecting to climate activists equally as with experts or scholars, scientists, local communities, gatherings. So starting a collaboration is something that you could do easily and without a lot of resources, but then you would have some sort of steps to take in order to strengthen the collaboration and maintaining it. And that would ideally include applying for funds, making an exhibition, or organizing an event. So this is sort of what the guidebook is thought to kind of help smaller institutions with. But at the same time, it also will benefit bigger institutions that have more resources to play with, because you could skip the first steps and just go straight into thinking about how to actually maintain a collaboration with local climate activists by applying for funding or making an exhibition. And one of these, of course, for me, an obvious example of climate activism is the young people rising up, the climate strikes. You have a lot of school kids engaged in this, and this is something that should be fostered really. And I think organizations that are involved in disseminating natural and cultural heritage should actually use this opportunity to establish collaboration with young people, because this is a really sort of it's amazing to see sort of the encouragement that these kids are bringing to the climate change discussion or debate. Other examples of how to actually solidify collaboration. The handbook will draw from diverse sources, international sources. For example, kids in museums, they have really nice guides about how to support young people, and also, for example, the Museums for Future initiative actually has an Icelandic translation of 10 simple actions that museums can do to support Fridays for Future movement and climate rights. Another example with these pathways is heritage, and this is something that kind of is built on this idea that museums are have collections. They are repositories of knowledge and expertise that can be very useful in disseminating or promoting understanding of climate change. So it should start with examining your own repositories, examine your collections, examine the exhibitions, what you have on display or what you have in what you are preserving, and ask this question, can a historical or an artistic perspective provide an important insight into planned action on a local, governmental, or even a global level? And I think, just as an example, you have, for example, the issue of land reclamation, which is a big sort of planned action in Iceland. And this is something that museums, for example, can actually provide a really important historical perspective. Just something I found on Sarpur, which is the digital database where you can actually online look through registered objects, photographs, and more from museums in Iceland. So here we have a photograph that is in the National Museum collection. This is a photograph by Magnus Óskarsson, and this is a bulldozer. And it's part of this sort of history of what we are kind of dealing with now in terms of land reclamation, reclaiming the wetlands from these processes of land use that started, existed throughout the 20th century. And providing a good history, a historical perspective on this process of what were the intentions of the agriculture to actually do this, and why was it done so much, and how quickly these the process of drying up wetlands actually took place would actually help in order to say, isn't it then just as easy to actually reverse this process, to do it so sort of powerfully as it was done, when we have different intentions today, but understanding what happened will actually help with the process, because otherwise you will have more, the debate will kind of polarize even more. So yeah, one example just quickly. And another thing about heritage or collecting is, of course, this idea about contemporary collecting or rapid response collecting. I have here just 2 examples from Oslo from last year in March, when there was a big climate strike march in the city center. 2 museums, the Museum of Science and Technology and the Natural History Museum, quickly responded on Facebook, on social media, and asked young people or people who were involved in the marches to send them photos. They wanted to collect, documentation of this sort of supposedly historical event, sort of proactively collecting information about what was taking place. And what the Natural History Museum did in the Botanical Garden, they actually put up sort of an outdoor exhibition, printing out a lot of these photographs that were sent to them. And that was, of course, in relation to their sort of climate museum that they opened recently now in April. So here are just, 2 examples of something that can be started and could easily lead into something bigger. So I think sort of the main emphasis of the handbook is to actually encourage this kind of gradual sort of building up of competencies, that engaging with climate change is not a hurdle or something that you can't grasp because it's so big. I mean, it is a really complex thing. There are so many effects, so many implications, that you don't have to kind of grasp it in its entirety, but you can definitely contribute through different pathways. As I said, this is an ongoing project, and the handbook is right now still in development. We have plans to make it available in February next year, but the COVID pandemic, of course, set everything sort of back a little bit. I wasn't, for example, able to go to Iceland to do field work and do this research part of the project, but I was lucky enough to get funding from the Research Center of Iceland to start the work together with Þórhallur Gröndal. So we were able to actually do this important part of the process of making the handbook.
Já, komið sæl öllsumul, Tinnar hérna með mér og kemur vonandi inn á eftir í umræðunum. But our talk is called Sustainability Lessons from the Turf House. But in it we are going to talk about sustainability and possible future in companionship with turf houses. For the past 5 years we have approached the Icelandic turf house as a multi-species assemblage, an architecture that is at once human and non-human, co-produced and cohabited, or as a wise being that may guide us how to live in the future. And here you can see a web page that we have online, and you can visit it after today for further information about this project that we call Turf Fiction. In our ongoing research that we title, like I said, Turf Fiction, we raise a set of questions in companion with the turf house towards rethinking possible living and dying, if you will, in the unfolding crisis of Anthropocene, mass extinction, deforestation, global warming, etc. Might find it peculiar why we rely on the turf house while discussing fundamental concepts such as environmental sustainability and possible futures. We hope that at the end of our talk, we have illustrated the benefits of the turf house as an interlocutor and a creative partner to think these matters, not least what sustainability involves. Given the fact that this seminar has participants who are potentially not familiar with turf houses, we would like to begin by introducing briefly the turf house. In order to do so, we have put together an excerpt drawn to include 14 turf houses on the Icelandic turf houses on a tentative list of World Heritage. But in 2011, the National Museum of Iceland submitted an application to include Icelandic turf houses on the World Heritage List. In theory, this application can be used as an example of how turf houses are perceived and claimed what are, especially as the application from an authoritative body on architecture. The National Museum's application is divided into 4 chapters: general description of the turf houses nominated that you just saw on the slide, previous slide, justification of outstanding universal value of turf houses, their authenticity and/or integrity, and lastly, a comparative view with similar properties. The general description consists of an outline of the turf house architectural tradition that are divided into 4 main threads. One is it amplifies turf house situatedness in the north, stating that it is an adaptation to local climate, local environmental resources, and societal economic development. Secondly, it narrates turf house architectural change on the basis of typological essentialism, or how turf houses evolved from one pure type to another. Third, it calls out special attention to material used in turf houses, such as turf and timber. The turf building blocks are given particular attention in this section of the application. And lastly, the craftsmanship of building turf houses is addressed in the general description. The 14 nominated turf houses are discussed in context of their location, age, spatial layout, or how they are clustered, and also function. You know, as a living quarter, stables for animals, religious function, and so on. Surroundings for vegetable gardening and cultural landscapes are marginally mentioned in this chapter of the application. In the chapter on justification of universal value, it states the preservational value of turf houses, uniqueness, how they are subject to generational knowledge, and reflecting changing aesthetic values. In the chapter on the authenticity and/or integrity of the turf house, of the turf houses nominated, All edifices score full house when it comes to the criteria of their preservational form, building methods, traditional amendments through the ages, integrity as a whole, and surrounding. A comparison is made between turf houses and other similar properties at the end of the application, but does not mention specific earthen architecture that has been preserved in the Nordic countries. At the end of the application, it is stated that the Icelandic turf house tradition are akin to the Chinese Fujian Tulu, which are seen here on the slide, but in the application they are seen, and this is an exact quote, as exceptional examples of a building tradition and function exemplifying a particular type of communal living, and in terms of their harmonious relationship with their environment, an outstanding example of human settlement, end of quote. Interestingly, emphasis on how turf houses are in harmonious relationship with their environment is entirely absent in the museum application. Moreover, the value of the turf house is based only on cultural elements, and a blind eye is turned to the value of natural elements, its agency, interrelations, etc., and also their aesthetics and in architectural context. For example, in a chapter on justification of outstanding universal value of turf houses, only two criteria are manifested, both cultural. And you can see the text in the application here on the slide. So the turf house justification that you can see here on the slide disregards paragraph 18 of the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. But the paragraph states that states parties should, as far as possible, endeavor to include in the submissions properties which derive their outstanding universal value from a particularly significant combination of cultural and natural features. This is striking, as turf houses are a unique combination of cultural and natural features, but not explored or dealt with significantly, as outstandingly so in the previously mentioned application. This official perspective that we have described for you and the qualifications given to the turf house tradition in the application differs radically from our perspective. We maintain that looking at the turf house merely in canonical terms, as evident in the application, it is limited. It is both anthropocentric and essentialist. We argue that it is impossible to understand turf house architecture, history, and aesthetics without approaching it as a nature-culture assemblage. The turf house, built on wetland turf, stones, and timber, is a multi-species architecture of entangled root soil, fungi, mycelium, microbes, plants, lichens, stones, wood, insects, mice, dogs, cows, sheep, and humans, to name a few. While soil, microorganisms, and rhizomatic root growth are the key builders of turf, the turf house architectural space is also formed by interspecies collaboration. The baðstofa, the human communal space in the turf house, for example, was occasionally built on top of the space that housed cows and sheep. This interspecies collaboration served to warm the baðstofa. The earthen passageway of the turf house connects all the spaces of the turf house. The air is saturated with the smells of soil. The soil lends the space its hues of brown and light, and dark gray from volcano ash. The turf house may come across as silent and static, but it is indeed a moving and acting living being, a giant in terms of skill and intellect. Thus, conceiving the turf house as simply a noun or a man-made object, or architecture is conventionally understood, is to distort the reality of the turf house as a living superorganism involved in ecosystemic acting, including photosynthesis, respiration, signaling, and biogeochemical processes, to name but a few doings. Thus, the turf house, which takes its shape from wise being and matter, is a vital force in the process of world making. The turf house clusters differ not only in number and size, depending on social need and economy, but every house is distinct and constantly transforming with the advent of future generations and new compositions of organisms. On this ground, we argue that the turf house should be recognized and comprehended as a verb. We take our inspiration in that regard from Robin Wall Kimmerer's sharing of Potawatomi philosophy and language. But Kimmerer, an ecologist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation in North America, explains elegantly how grammar of animacy, reflected in the rich uses of verbs in the Potawatomi language, makes perceivable, and here is a quote, the life that pulses through all things, end of quote. For example, a bay, vikvegama, is a verb, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. However, a bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word, to quote Kimmerer. The picture of the turf house that we draw here as co-produced and cohabited multi-species architecture is a novel one and quite different from the aforementioned application accepted or conventional descriptions of turf houses. We argue, however, that it is impossible to disentangle tightly interwoven nature and cultural aspects in the turf house. Indeed, humans harvest the turf to build the house, but as the house is built, the turf removed from the wetland, containing water, microbes, invertebrates, and rhizomes, the matter starts to dry and transform. Organisms such as sedges, wetland body, retreat, and aerobic microbes take over, replacing anaerobic inhabitants. A process of succession occurs as seeds and plants take root over time, resulting in a total species turnover and the formation of new interspecies connections that also take part in fixing nitrogen, sequestering CO2, etc. Importantly, as already mentioned, the turf house is always in process of becoming, making visions and relations with the future. Moreover, the health of turf house inhabitants depends on the multiple relations occurring beyond human agency. No plant or critter is considered out of place. Each house is a unique ecosystem, inseparable from the land and its environment. In this light, concepts such as biodiversity, species richness and life histories, community webs, ecology, landscape, mutualism, nutrient cycling, to name but a few, should therefore consequently be included in attempts to understand the turf house. its aesthetics and contributions. Thus, should the turf house be under both the cultural and natural sector when it comes to supervision and conservation. For quite some time, scholars have highlighted the reductionism of the dualistic order, nature, culture, and human, non-human, that language and modern system in the Western world is built on and threatens the natural environment and our existence. Donna Haraway, for instance, suggests that at this point, the time of techno-fixes that will save humans from the damage planet has passed. As he affirms, we must stay with the trouble, one being to contest the borders of the natural and cultural divide, including object-subject, human-animal, theory-practice, facts, values, etc. Our future depends on how we see nature, or as Haraway stated 3 decades ago, the reinvention of nature, perhaps the most central arena of hope, oppression, and contestation for inhabitants of the planet Earth in our times. But let's now move towards the concept of sustainability, a concept that was supposed to give future generations hope, or as Gro Harlem Brundtland's definition of sustainability stated, and here is a quote, "Sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs," end of quote. This definition, as so many others that have come along describing sustainable development, have fostered anthropocentrism, building on the aforementioned dualism of man and nature, where humans are in hierarchical relations with nature and place themselves above and center. Humans see themselves as the only source of value and count only themselves as beings. Today, however, we have seen a revolutionary transition towards nature being considered to have value in itself, as opposed to the general idea that nature is the object of humans and or their property. In fact, nature has acquired rights and the status of a legal person in constitutions such as the ones of Bolivia and Ecuador. But what does that mean? The Constitution of Ecuador, for example, recognizes the inalienable rights of ecosystems, give individuals the authority to petition on behalf of ecosystems and require the government to remedy violations of nature's right, including the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles, structures, functions, and its processes in evolution. We can see a similar approach towards nature in New Zealand, in leadership of the Maori people, who see themselves as inseparable from the land, and their obligation is to care for nature as their kin, as their ancestors. Both the river Wanganui and the Park Te Urevera have been bestowed with legal personhood. This relational view, as present among many indigenous and First Nations in the world, where human well-being rests on nature well-being. That indeed shifts humans to recognize their obligations and accountability towards nature. The same thread of responsibility, the same thread of responsible caring lies at the heart of what the turf house teaches us about sustainability. The turf house, where some species immigrate and others disappear, matter shifts as stones move and organisms and plants decompose, is in constant need for attention and care. If not cared for, the turf house will collapse. Thus, the turf house calls for practices of sensing and caring for other than humans, not as a liability or to be reduced to moral basis. It is an active and transformative engagement in making sustainable, livable worlds and thus enhancing all beings. As Pure de la Bella states, and here's a quote, "Ecological interdependency is not a moral principle, but a lived material constraint, required and obligated," end of quote. Recognizing humans is not simply an ethical exercise. It is an obligation, as without them there is no turf house, no home, no future. The turf house nurtures the complexes of pluriverse and growing coexistence. Thus, one of the turf house lessons to sustainability are to hold open space for non-human and their needs and forming relations by facilitating practices of caring for what other beings need. Caring for interrelations demands work and knowledge of matter and species. It involves a responsibility and accountability for the lively relationalities of becoming of which we are, to quote the scholar Karen Barad. The turf house reminds us that interspecies relations, which it is made of or are always unfinished and precarious, it involves at once human and non-human flourishing and difficult togetherness, which vulnerability, violence, and death are part. As such, the turf house is a symbiotic world made with other species, or as Donna Haraway states, we become with each other or not at all. Thus, our needs and the prosperity of future generations rest on fulfilling the needs of nature and or non-humans. Another turf house lesson on sustainability in relation to what we have just stated. The turf house cultivated for over 30 generations of humans, hundreds of generations of lichens, thousands of generations of plants, and billions of generations of microbes, brings to today's continuous time of capitalism into conversation with other than human temporalities. As such, it involves revolutionizing perceptions of the anthropocentric timescale of the capitalist present. The diverse timescales of the turf house stretches from hours to 100,000 years. At once, the turf house embodies the deep geological time of eroding stones and the shorter biological life cycles of protozoans, nematodes, arthropods, plants, and many others measured in years, months, weeks, days, and hours. On an evolutionary scale, the turf house elders have even billions of years, longer than humans. In other words, the turf house is embedded with multiple temporalities of non-human others and their diverse ways of existence, life histories, and relations. In order to make time, which lies at the heart of the notion of sustainability, that is, to secure a future for the next generations, humans need to grasp a more nuanced understanding of time. Time is not absolute, and addressing time in units, hours, days, as we have done here, fosters the idea of, as Karen Barad reminds us, of moments exist one at a time and replace one another in succession. That is not the case. It is easy to understand this by referring to the nuclear explosions of 1945 in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, for example. That time has still not passed. While understanding time and the future of human practices of past and present as a geological force, the urgency rises to trouble capitalist instantaneous notion of time. Thus, sustainability is about adopting and incorporating a multiplying perspective of time and bear in mind that temporalities of care unfold through embodied engagement situated and interactive practices and tempos that are not in tune nor on time in the capitalist present. So to conclude, Anthropocene is indeed a conflicted concept, and it may sound ironic that the era we live today is named after man, Anthropos. At the same time, the urgency has never been greater to reject anthropocentrism and recognize the entangled human and non-human forces of life and their interconnectedness. Museums will have to respond to the cry of a more symbiotic approach to sustainability. It has never before been as urgent as today that museums address the issues that have caused the impasse we are now in and how to proceed. Our companion and interlocutor, the turf house, this wise being, is here to contribute to an alternative ontology which resists anthropocentrism, which has tainted all aspects of our society and ecologies. Thank you.
Hello, all of you. I'm happy to be here to participate in this online symposium. It has been very interesting to listen to all those papers today, and what I am about to contribute, as you said, is this ongoing exhibition in one of our exhibition halls at the National Gallery of Iceland. So Solastalgia is an immersive installation mixing AR techniques or augmented reality with contemporary art, multisensorial effects, and sound design of high quality. I will describe the artwork of this immersive installation in more details later, but when Margrét Hallgrímsdóttir approached me early this year, or even was it last year, as she heard of this upcoming exhibition, the initial idea was to get the guests of the symposium to visit the show. But due to COVID restriction, we won't be able to, but the installation will hopefully be open in December. We are actually closed now, but we are hoping to open in next week. So you have the chance to visit it, those of you who haven't already, and those of you that are in Iceland. We will close it in January. However, it is somehow symbolic to be sitting here at my desk using the technology of our times, the computer, and talking to you through this channel and tell you about an extraordinary artwork that by all meanings was supposed to be exhibited in the context of an exhibition policy that I refer to as progressive, not only for us here at the National Gallery, but also for the overall scene of art exhibitions today. This cutting-edge event, which Solastalgia is. Solastalgia is the contribution of the National Gallery to the Reykjavík Art Festival on its 50th anniversary. So it was important for us to explore the role of Reykjavík Art Festival towards the National Gallery. The history of these two. We have participated in the festival with quite many outstanding projects through the years, and often they have been cutting edge for the National Gallery in many ways. I went through this background as an argument to finally accept the proposal the Reykjavík Art Festival did, as Vigdís Jakobsdóttir, the director of the festival, came to me and convinced me to show Solastalgia. I liked the idea that we would step out from our comfort zone, if you can say so, and deal with a whole new era of exhibition type with these new AR techniques that are much further advanced than VR headset, virtual reality techniques. With AR, you see your surroundings and you are aware of the space you are in while using those headsets, and you move with AR lenses, while with VR you are blocked in dark glasses and standing still or not really moving, and most often sitting. So as I say, this was a cutting-edge project in so many ways, technical ways. I hardly knew those techniques at the time, and yes, I must admit it was a lot about the techniques. This unbelievable, exciting turn point for an art museum to embrace. But first and foremost, I thought the techniques and the topic of the authors they are tackling, it gained a meaning in an effective and powerful way together. The exhibition Solastalgia was scheduled to open in July, which it did, but when we took the decision to become a venue, we could of course not foresee what would happen in 2020, and I must say that the philosophical context of this exhibition has grown even bigger with Solastalgia and the COVID pandemic juxtaposing each other during these last months. The artists behind Solastalgia are two French filmmakers and artists, Pierre-Alain Giraud and Antoine Viviani, and their production company, Providence, in France. A team of great artists collaborated with them on this ambitious project, many of them Icelanders, as you see by their names on the PowerPoint slide. Pierre-Alain Giraud lives a part of the year in Iceland and has worked and collaborated with Icelandic artists in various projects. Giraud and Viviane have been working on Solastalgia for many years, and the work, the Solastalgia immersive installation, first opened in Rennes, the city in Bretagne in France, a year ago, in a science and cultural center. The version we have here at the National Gallery of Iceland is the second. So in Rennes, it was a pilot project with great support from local cultural authorities that we also benefited from, as the technical challenge was quite a part of the realization, and many things at stake in Rennes with the AR HoloLens equipment, taken by artists to use in a whole new way. Solastalgia became also a collaborative project here in Iceland, as the National Gallery took a part of the production with the artists, and the Reykjavik Art Festival was also a significant collaborator by adding various support that was very important to us. So when we opened Solastalgia, Giraud and Viviane had added new characters in the script. We had the script translated in Icelandic, of course, and we had Icelandic actors both playing and interpreting voices of the figures. And last but not least, Giraud and Viviane added newer HoloLens, HoloLens 2, the headset from Microsoft, launched on the market time just months before our opening in July. So the outcome in Iceland is quite different from what you saw in Rennes. The work is now in 3 languages, Icelandic, French and English. And technical supervision was directed by Matthew Denuy, which is the engineer, you could say, of this version. To start with, the word Solastalgia. I want to add this word to your vocabulary, if it's not already there. When we first hear it, we think of science fiction. This neologism is part of another world, not our common world. It's fiction, and you can imagine and build up an image of a world that you don't have to prove its existence. That is science fiction. Nevertheless, this word, Solastalgia, is not from science fiction, and I could say, unfortunately, it simply describes the culpability of the human era living now on Earth. Solastalgia, distress caused by environmental change. This word is quite certainly surrounded by other neologisms and even much better understood today by us, I believe, which is flight shame. I just wanted to add this word, just to, in a way, draw up how fast things have gone through the past months since the COVID pandemic. Things are changing. Our behavior, we are waking up. And when Vigdís Jakobsdóttir was outlining the core of solastalgia on a big introduction meeting in autumn 2019, and she quite theatrically explained in front of 30 people that were present the essence of the word solastalgia, this neologism, the distress, the flight shame, was not as relevant as it is today, but it was already, we knew already this feeling and this shame. So solastalgia is a part of this vocabulary as well. The technology and the arts are woven together. We often see how artists embrace and continue developing things that science has brought us. I could mention in this context the Icelandic artist Steina Vasulka and her late husband, Woody Vasulka, that they were forerunners and protagonists in video art by taking equipments and developing them further to their righteous purpose they needed to make their artworks. That's how artists tend to work, to explore, and not to be preoccupied by any boundaries. And these HoloLens techniques, the headsets, are used and have been developed by the American Army. And on this slide, you see some advertising photos of the lenses I took on the internet. So the lenses are used by engineers, scientists, doctors, and I heard they work very well on oil rigs, or in those remote conditions, you would need precise mechanical instructions, for instance. So you are all now aware of the fact that solastalgia has this huge technical aspect, which is of course also a part of the philosophy of the work that you will see in the introduction of the authors. To introduce better the work, I'm going to describe it a bit. It was my B plan. Walking along with your HoloLenses as a guest, you are experiencing a post-human Earth where only a cloud of data has survived. And now I just want to read the introduction text. So, visitors from a mysterious future explore a post-human Earth where only a mysterious cloud of light has survived. Before their extinction, the last generations of a small community of humans invented a machine that allowed them to live one of their chosen memories forever, like perfect holograms repeating the same gestures over and over again. The visitors, us, discovered their worlds and stories while walking around the exhibition space. Our faith in technology has never been greater. We spend our life connected to the network. Technological progress carries our hopes. It might not only make us more powerful, but, who knows, it might even save us. Yet, scientists worldwide say that this radiant technological future looks compromised. Humanity is about to undergo a crisis unprecedented in its history. The decline of living beings, climate imbalance, and many other disturbing factors are prompting us to reflect on our civilization's fragility. Solastalgia is born of this tension and dizziness. So solastalgia questions the essence of our existence, our beliefs, and the challenges facing the Anthropocene. The work Solastalgia, this is a link I'm gonna send to you. I'm not gonna try, I will just continue, but this is a 5 minutes interview that was made recently in the radio broadcast, by the radio broadcast service in Iceland. And I just, where you have also the authors explaining in much better detail their project, and you get a better notion of the work. Perhaps some of you have already seen this. So solastalgia evokes many questions, and this exhibition is in its overall aspect a great contribution or a platform to offer to public to deal with urgent questions that museums do with their projects. I do not intend to develop here all the urgent aspects the work evokes, as you still have the opportunity to see solastalgia yourself. The environmental aspect is primordial, and as the authors put it, also the technology and our trust to technology as solution versus the fear we should have of our reliance of all this great development. So the question could be, where will this development end? In March this year, when there were only a few months ahead until the opening of solastalgia and the COVID pandemic burst out, we deeply overweighed if solastalgia was too difficult for people to experience, if the pandemic and all the shock it entailed meant it was irresponsible to offer this Armageddon, this world, to our visitors. So this was an ethical question which arose. We came to the conclusion that this was really the right time to open solastalgia, calling a certain reality check. This autumn, we have had many high school students on visit, and we get feedback from them. Important feedback. One teacher told us she used solastalgia to prepare her students before they read Eyland, a recent bestseller of Sigríður Hagalín Björnsdóttir, which describes a horrific vision of an apocalyptic future in Iceland. Apparently, solastalgia has its effects on young minds, and the staff at the responsible for education have reached out to schools to prepare their visit with great ambitions. And I have a great person responsible for this from the staff, Ragnheiður Vignisdóttir, who is here also with us, and she will be, she's my backup in responding if you have any questions later on, as I unfortunately I can't attend the whole time. Solastalgia, as a temporary exhibition in our premises, also plays a bigger role in the exhibition context, as we have on display in another exhibition gallery on the upper floor of the museum, a big installation from our collection made by artist Katrín Sigurðardóttir, High Plane 6. This installation interacts with solastalgia and was chosen to be displayed for 1 year and during the same time as solastalgia. As many of you know, we have limited exhibition space, but it was important to use this opportunity to add a very meaningful work from the collection for the visitor to experience, and the occasion to show High Plane and solastalgia together in this way was also to underline the environmental context. On the internet, on our website, is an interview with Katrín Sigurðardóttir and about this work and how the meaning of the work, High Plane, has changed and developed during the past years because of the environmental changes. So that's very interesting for you to see, and I will send the link as well to you all at the National Museum to distribute, if you would be so kind. I would just like to thank you all for having this opportunity of telling you about Solastalgia, this important exhibition. I could also admit that we, of course, wanted huge crowds to come to see Solastalgia. We only are able to show it for 10 people at a time. It takes 35 minutes, and we have some days left of it until the beginning of January next year. So yeah, it's soon. But because of the COVID pandemic, we had much less people, much less crowd than we hoped for, but still it's for our local audience, it's for our local guests, and it's important the fact that high school students, younger people have come to the museum, have rushed to us, and we even see a new audience coming and and understanding the role of an art museum as ours in contributing to address the importance of the environmental issues in our exhibition policy. So I just want to thank you all for listening. I'm sitting in my office where you see the arrow, and yeah, thank you all.
I want to thank Margrét Hallgrímsdóttir and the other organizers for offering me the opportunity of sharing with you the story of our current big project here at the Herring Museum in Siglufjörður, the Salt House or Salthúsið. I felt that I had to start with a short introduction on the museum itself. And now my slides are not changing. Do you see them changing?
Nay.
Yeah. Now.
Oh, yeah.
As I know that some of the participants today are not from Iceland and maybe not familiar with the museum, but also Icelanders may not be well familiar with it. But the Herring Museum is located in Siglufjörður in the north of Iceland. Siglufjörður is known to be the northernmost town in the country, so we are right at the center of the north, we can say. It's a small community with about 1,200 inhabitants, but the museum itself has a history of about 25 years or a little over that. So the museum has been growing and expanding in the past 2 to 3 decades, but it has a rather special history, we can say, as it was built up completely by volunteers, just regular locals, mostly local teachers from the elementary school, who had a dream and a vision of building up a museum to do the history of the herring industry justice. So our collection, it counts tens of thousands of items, and our exhibitions count over 2,500 square meters. So in many ways, we are a large museum, and we sometimes like to state that the Herring Museum is the largest maritime and industrial museum in the country. But if we, on the other hand, evaluate our size by something other than the size of our collection or the sizes of our exhibitions, for example, by the number of staff, then we drop down the list quite quickly, as we have at the moment only 2.5 staff members working at the museum all year round. But during the summer, we usually, in a COVID-free world, have more staff members helping out during the season from May and throughout September. So for a part of the year, we're somewhere close to 10 to 12 usually. But our museum keeps growing with the Salt House, which is the topic of my talk here today. But also I wanted to mention that the Herring Museum has been fortunate enough to be awarded for its exhibitions and work. For example, with the Icelandic Museum Award in 2000 and the European Museum Award as the best new industry museum in Europe in 2004. And we've had growing visitor numbers in the past decades. In a pre-COVID world, we were somewhere around 25 to 27,000 visitors per year, with over 70% of them coming from around the world. So most of them foreigners and travelers. A little bit about our public mission. The museum's public mission is to preserve, collect, registrate, and display items that are related to the herring industry of Iceland, not only our local herring industry, but of the whole country. We also aim to collect, preserve information and objects related to fisheries, biology, and research on the herring stocks, salting stations, herring factories, coopers and their work, and so on and so on. So we work in a rather wide perspective, we can say, because we also aim to preserve our local history. Our museum collection, it consists of buildings, ships, houses, and then smaller items such as household gears, fishing gear, work equipment, machinery, clothing, textiles, photographs in hundreds of thousands, and so on and so on. We aim to work well with all levels of students. And this year, for example, we're doing a trial project of teaching 10-year-olds and teenagers weekly throughout the whole school year, not only teaching them about our museum, but about museums in general. And it's going very well, and it's a very exciting project. We also aim to work as hard as we can on historical research, and then as well to work with others, with colleagues, with other museums and institutions, and so on. And also we aim to preserve endangered working methods, such as how to gut and pack herring into barrels, how to build and repair wooden boats, and so on. So we have a quite wide public mission, but our main challenges for the last few years, after almost or little over 2 decades of building up the museum, have been in regards to our collection management. In the first years, the people that stood behind the museum, they collected everything they could get their hands on, we can say. Not everything was accessioned. They just decided to collect more than less, so they would have enough to work from, building up the museum and putting together the exhibitions. So the museum has been expanding from its starting years, from just an idea to a single building to 2, and then to 3, and so on and so on. So as we somehow put an end point to the construction period of the museum, we felt we had time and space to focus on other projects. And we saw that our main challenges were in relation to our collection, which was housed in 7 different buildings, most of them not in very good conditions. So our current storages, they do not meet the set requirements for accredited museums. Also, a big part of the collection has not yet been accessioned. So we need to go through it all and evaluate and decide on each and every object. But most importantly, we just needed proper facilities to store our museum collection that is not on exhibit. So that will be my main theme here today, to share with you the story of the Salt House, which will, once it's ready, like I mentioned, it's an ongoing project, will be our main storage building and will give us new and very valuable facilities. But the house has a big history. It's actually an 18th century building that was originally built in Russia by the White Sea as a part of a whaling station. At some point, Norwegian businessmen or whalers bought it, and they decided to move it to Iceland, where they rebuilt it in 1893 in Tálknafjörður in the west of Iceland. There it stood for half a century or so until it was taken down again and shipped to Iceland, where it was part of the Kea Empire, and it was used for tanning sheepskin for decades. Then it became out of use in Akureyri, and I do believe that a certain group wanted just to demolish it and get rid of it, as it had no use. Fortunately, the building itself was saved, but in 1999 it was taken down piece by piece in Akureyri and stored under plastic outdoors for the next 15 years until it was shipped to Siglufjörður, where it is today, and has since then been in the process of being rebuilt as a part of the Herring Museum. So we sometimes say that the house is a world traveler. It's gone quite widely. And the old picture that you see on the screen, the building closer to us on the picture is the Salt House. And this picture is from Tolkien. It's the oldest one we have of the building. We've yet been able to find a picture from its time in Russia, even though that would be very, very valuable. But as you can see, it's gone through quite the transformation in its 3 Icelandic hometowns in the last 130 years or so. We are far from finished, but many have asked us the reason why. Why did you decide to take on an old house for this project? Why didn't you build a new one where it would be easier to, easier to work with in general, easier to make decisions, and easier to design it exactly how you want it and how you need it and so on. So I have a few points on how and why. But before the house was taken down piece by piece in 1999 in Akureyri, the National Museum of Iceland, who were the then owners of the building, had architects measure it and make proper architectural drawings for it to be reconstructed at some point in the future. But they didn't really know when that would happen or where that would happen. At the time, they had ideas of it being rebuilt in Akureyri as the National Museum's branch in the north of Iceland. That didn't happen and hasn't happened yet. Also, there were ideas of it serving as a new museum building for some of the museums in Akureyri. But these were just ideas, and they didn't really lead to any decision-making or any constructions or anything such like that. So the brainstorming continued. And Margrét Hallgrímsdóttir, Museum of Iceland, she contacted us here in Siglufjörður in, I think it was in 2012, might have been 2011. And she suggested we would take on the house. She was aware of our lack of storage facilities, but she also tended to believe that we could take over the house and we could see through the project of rebuilding it, as the story of our museum itself is kind of colored by taking on big and in some ways crazy ideas and seeing them through. But we did need a little time to think about it, because at that time in 2012, we felt that for the first time we kind of had the space to relax a little bit after 25 years of rebuilding, new building, making new exhibition, and so on and so on. So it had been quite busy, and importantly, we were also just so very, very happy that we had just finished paying off everything that the upbuilding of our museum had cost. So we were debt-free, and we felt that we should allow ourselves to take it easy for a few years. But yet, after thinking about it back and forth, discussing it back and forth, we came to the conclusion of not being able to say no to the National Museum's offer. It was too good to decline, even though we weren't really sure on how to fully finance this massive project. But we still decided to say yes. We would at least have the house, have some architectural drawings to work from, and we would figure out the rest as we'd go. So the house was, we can say the house was a gift from the National Museum of Iceland, as they gifted us the woods and helped us transport them from Akureyri to Siglufjörður. So we made a written agreement on the Herring Museum taking over the house in 2013. And the year after, we transported it to here. But the main reason for us accepting the offer was that we were in desperate needs of proper storage facilities for our collection. We were also very charmed by the house itself and its history, its architecture, structure, and quality, because believe it or not, the woods were still in very good quality, even though having been around for decades and also having lain on the ground for 15 years. But at the same time, the idea and mission of somehow saving a historical building from being destructed and finding it a new meaningful purpose made us even more excited about the project. Salt House also brought new opportunities to the development of our museum, as we saw that we would be able to use the house for more than just storage facilities, even though that was and still is the main role of the building. The house gave us additional space for a new exhibition, and it also finally gave us space to offer our visitors to simply sit down and have a cup of coffee. So the house will more or less be split into 4 main spaces, we can say, which I will tell you a bit more about later on. But over 2/3 of the house are dedicated to storage facilities and preservation. And therefore, the house will implement a complete change of work environment for the staff of the museum. As today, like I mentioned, our collection is stored here and there in 7 different places, and not all of them have any working conditions really. So we mostly just have our desks at our office, and this will be a big, big change. But at the same time, it will also be a big step towards better meeting the set requirements for accredited museums in Iceland. The house itself and its new purpose. Here you see the very fine architectural drawings and the looks of the exterior of the building. But the house itself, it has 2 floors. So it's a total of about 600 square meters, 300 square meters each floor. So we will have, we can say, 2 different conservation and storage facilities, both upstairs and downstairs. We can take about 2/3 of the house, upstairs and downstairs, and that will be the storage facilities on 2 floors. So on the lower floor, we will have a cold storage for engines and machinery, steel and iron tools, fishing equipment, and more of these large museum items that don't need the same what can I say, temperatures and as the more vulnerable parts of the collection. But on the upper floor, we will have storage that will be more suited for the vulnerable items of our collection, for our textiles, household items, artwork, archives, clothing, and so on and so on. Also, we will have a new space for a new exhibition upstairs on the loft in the south end, where we're going to be focusing more on our local history, on the winter in the herring town, because that remains as a bit of a mystery for our visitors. They come here and learn everything about the herring era, the herring season, which lasted for only 3 to 4 months a year. So they're still left with the question, what on earth did people do here in this town during the winter? And that is the question we tend to answer in the new exhibition. But also downstairs in the southern end, where you see the big glass doors, there we will have this open space for visitors, where we plan to have a museum cafe and a souvenir shop. As the museum is quite large with its many buildings, I think it will be a big change for our visitors to have the opportunity to sit down and have a cup of coffee as they go through the buildings. But since we started reconstructing the house, we've worked towards this 10-year plan we set at the beginning in 2014. As the aim was, and still is, to finish this big project, to reconstruct the house over a time period of 1 decade, in order not to have to indebt the museum. So every year, we've done exactly as much as we can afford. So it's happening slowly than it could, more slowly than it could, but we feel that we have everything under good control at the same time. We've had very valuable support for the project from the Prime Minister's Office, from the Ministry of Education and Culture, from Safna, from our local municipality, Fjallabygd, and also from Húsafriðunarsjóður. And our growing visitor numbers in the past years, they have also brought us growing numbers of income, which has helped us and enabled the museum itself to invest richly in the project with its own contribution. But in the next few slides, I've picked photographs that I want to share with you guys, with the aim of visualize the adventure of getting the house to Siglufjörður from Akureyri and reconstructing it here. Also, the photographs, some of them at least, will shed light on the theme of my talk, recycling and sustainability, because we've really done our best to reuse and recycle as much as possible, change out as little as possible, and always somehow guard and look at the house's history throughout the whole project. But for 15 years, from 1999 to 2014, the house was stored outdoors in Akureyri, as you can see on these pictures. And like I mentioned already, they were in surprisingly good condition, but it was quite a lot. It's material for a whole house. And the whole house, it was somehow taken down, not like piece by piece or wood by wood, but puzzle by puzzle. Some of them quite large, as you can see on the pictures over here, which meant that we had to transport it by sea. There was no way to get it to Siglufjörður by car or by road, as there's no way to get here to Siglufjörður without driving through narrow tunnels. And there was no possible way of getting the biggest pieces of the building through the tunnels. For example, the gable fronts of the house came in a single piece. So we did 2 trips by sea, transferring the woods to Siglufjörður, and this was during the summer of 2014. And then once it was here, we started puzzling it back together at the museum grounds. So we really do hope that the house is finally in its final location, even though it would be interesting to add to its story of travels. But we plan on just keeping it here for the future. But it was quite the puzzle to get it back together, because it came with handwritten notes or instructions, and the woods were then marked with Roman numbers. So the carpenters, they did an incredible job of puzzling it back together. But at the same time, locals, they didn't really understand what was going on once they saw the house coming together. They didn't really see the charm just yet. So we who worked here at the museum, we were quite often stopped, just going to the post office or the supermarket, stopped by random local people, asked what on earth we were thinking, saving this old, awful looking house. And why didn't we just build a new one? Like, it couldn't make sense of decisions made here at the museum. But everything was to change quite a lot. But like I mentioned, we try to look to the building's history as much as we possibly can. Before it came here, we had decided to paint it green, just because we felt it would fit in well with the other buildings around, our other museum buildings. But as we saw the old wooden cladding underneath the corrugated iron that was outside the house, we saw all the colors it had held at some point. And we soon realized that we should, of course, try to find the oldest one and make that the future color of the house. So that's what we did. We chose the current color of the house from the old cladding, and we do believe that it was exactly this color decades ago, even 100. So we started for the first 2 years or so, we focused on the exterior and everything linked to the exterior of the house. So it transformed in the first 2 or 3 years, as you can see on these 2 pictures. But as we were close to finishing the exteriors, we also stopped getting questions about what we were thinking on or how we had based the decision of taking or accepting this old house and what we were going to do with it. Because it really, truly is a beautiful building. But even though at this point, this was in 2016, we had reached the phase of looking very good from the outdoors. We had a lot of work yet to do indoors. So I would say that the indoors are even, it's a way bigger task than the exterior. We started with strengthening the house and its structure and the upper floor. We had to completely strengthen the floor in between the 2 floors. Surprisingly, we didn't have to change out many of the beams, but a few of them. And as you can see on these pictures, we didn't really have a floor at that point. As we had a floor to make an upper floor and a lower floor, we decided to start with the upstairs, finish the upstairs, the storage space there, and then continuing to other spaces in. But the old floorboards that are from 1893, from when the house came to Tálknafjörður, they were beautiful. The carpenters, their first look, they thought it was just rubbish. We would certainly buy new ones. But we paused and looked at the old floorboards, and we figured we had to somehow save them and keep them in the house. So we decided to repair and reuse the original floorboards. It meant we had to do a lot of repairing. I don't know if you can see it on the middle picture, but it's kind of like cheese. It all has these small holes that needed to be fixed. They were from the old nails. The carpenters were not excited as we were about this project and the reuse of the floorboards, as they had to repair over 4,000 nail holes in about 100 square meters. But we feel that it was completely worth it, as they look very, very good today. And we managed it more. We didn't really have any leftovers. It was just enough for the exhibition space. So it all worked out perfectly somehow. But as the house was a gift from the National Museum, it came with an extra package, because we also got the old window frames from Bessastaðastofa along with the house, as they were not in use anymore and they fitted. So now the Salt House has the old window frames from Bessastaðastofa in each and every window, which is very, very valuable, and also a very good example of reusing. But the current status of this project is that we have finished more or less one of the 4 spaces. The upper floor storage and our conservation facilities are ready, and we just started installing shelves and racks, and we will soon start moving parts of our collection to the new storages. But at the same time, we have contractors working on the exhibition space upstairs, which you see on the picture on your left, and also on the open space for visitors downstairs that you see on your right. These pictures are very, very fresh, taken just yesterday. But they show how they are just finishing with cladding the walls. All electricity pipes have been installed already. This is a quite complicated project because along the way, we figured that the structure of the building was simply so beautiful that we couldn't hide it behind new cladding. But in order to do things more cheap, more quick, that's what we would have had to do. But we decided not to. We decided to let the house and its structure shine through, as you can see here. It makes it all the more time consuming and expensive, as they have to, well, more or less make every single piece exactly by the millimeter. But also it makes it complicated because of regulations, strictly, mostly related to be fireproof completely. So it needs to be double. So they kind of have to do it all twice. But in my opinion, it is completely worth it, because as on the picture on the right, which is taken in the storage facilities upstairs, as we just finished earlier this year, it gives the house all the more character, and it really would have been a shame to hide its history behind new walls. But the big question that we both have asked ourselves and others have asked us as well is, why not build a new house? I would say that number one, because of the house and its history, it adds value to the building, but at the same time, it adds complications. Deciding to use an old house like this, it means that you have to adjust to many things. You have to adjust to its size, its spaces, its limits, and so on. And you have to be willing to make compromises. This meant that we had to accept certain limitations, and we had to give up certain ideas we had about our possible new future storage facilities. And we had to make many compromises along the way. So we really just have to work within the frame the house gives us. But as the house was first constructed in Iceland in 1893, and even earlier in Russia, in many ways, it's somehow just a noble feeling to have founded a new purpose towards the future. And also somehow the feeling of having saved the building, because it didn't have a purpose for the 15 years that it laid on the ground in Akureyri. So we feel that, well, we are very thankful to have been given the opportunity of taking on this task. But also it's a perfect example of recycling, reusing, and working towards sustainability, as we try our very, very best to recycle and reuse as much as we possibly can. And the house is, of course, from wood, built from wood completely. So it's a very natural building, we can say. And I'm pretty sure by now that there's not a strict line in the building anywhere. As you can see on the picture of the window, you're not really sure if it's right or not. But the window itself is right. But there are not many tight straight lines in the building. So it has been quite the challenge to take on, especially for the carpenters. But it most certainly has pros, cons, gains, and costs. I'm not going to list them all here. But at the end of the day, we do feel that the pros and the gains, they value more than the cons and the costs. But having said that, I also want to say that this has been a massive learning experience, going through this, just building the house. And for me, who studied history and museum studies, I had no idea how to build a house. And having to work with the contractors, it has made me have to learn a lot of new things about woods, about how to build a house, how to lay pipelines and electricity, and so on and so on. So it's been a very challenging project, and it gives a lot and it adds a lot. And I think it's an experience you can't learn from a book or a lecture. So I think it will give me a lot into the future to have taken part in this big project. But also working towards a 10-year plan and a tight budget, it requires patience and resourcefulness. So not only linked to the house itself, but also things we'll be using inside the house. We're trying to recycle and use what we have. For example, all the racks and the shelves that we are now installing into the upper floor. We got them all from the Icelandic liquor stores as they were exchanging theirs in Reykjavik. We were able to get theirs, and they donated their old ones. So they donated them to the museum, and we've been using them here, both saving us money, but also giving perfectly fine shelves another chance. I do not know if we will be able to do this in 10 years, but I sure hope so. It's going well at the moment, even though everything is slowing down quite a lot due to the pandemic. But I do believe that that is something that not only us here are facing as a challenge, but museums and businesses everywhere around the world. But we are very thankful also for the wide support we have gotten for this project. So having financial support means that we are able to continue, at least for now. So I very, very much hope so. Hope that we will be done by 2024. If not, then we will just take a bit longer as needed. But the main goal is to do this well, to do this correctly, as well as we can, and not to rush things too much just to get them finished. Rather to do them well and be very happy with the final result. But that is my last slide. So once again, I just want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share the project.